Okay, then. Should we start?
Yeah, I'm good to start.
Just wait just a little moment. I want to say something to you to introduce you at least. As I understood it, you're just currently working on your PhD at Birkbeck College, University in London. And it's pretty much the same title, except that you now focus on here Midgley and food, as I understand it. And you will give us a sort of comparison between the both of them. Is that right? Correct?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah.
Okay. Then if you want to just start.
Okay, I'm going to do some slides if that's okay.
Yeah, you can.
I'll just share my screen.
Yeah.
If I can. Let me know whether this works.
Yes.
Okay, are you seeing a screen?
Yes.
Okay, here we go. Yes, thank you for the introduction. As you say, I'm just in the middle of my PhD now, and I'm looking at Mary Midgley's ethical naturalism as my focus. But today I want to talk about Midgley and Foote because I'm using Philippa Foote's naturalism as like a foil to understanding Mary Midgley's. So I'm going to give about a 20-minute talk and then hopefully some time for questions. So hopefully this paper will contribute to the overall aim of my PhD thesis, which, as I say, is a historical and a contemporary revival of Mary Midgley's ethical naturalism. Just get to the next slide. Okay, so the context of my research, Midgley's naturalism has been heavily neglected within philosophical literature, or Midgley's philosophy more generally has been heavily neglected. So I'm trying to use Foote to sort of bring out Midgley's naturalism because Foote's naturalism has been much more clearly debated in the literature. So Foote and Midgley met at Oxford during World War II, and they remained friends throughout their lives. And there's been an interest in their relationship and in a broader relationship between four women in what we call now the wartime quartet. So these are, as I've listed on the screen, Iris Murdoch, Mary Midgley, Philippa Foote, and Elizabeth Anscombe. So all four of these women met in Oxford during World War II, and the In Parentheses project in Durham has started to theorise these four women as a school. I've put the link on the screen. But today I'm just going to be looking at Mary and Foote, and I want to try and draw out similarities between two of their two books in particular, which is Midgley's very first book she publishes in 1978, Beast and Man, and Philippa Foote's final book she publishes in 2001, Natural Goodness. So I think there are remarkable similarities between the naturalisms of these two women, which I'm exploring and charting in my PhD. But today I just want to look at an important difference, which I'm going to explain. So the outline of my talk briefly, this is where I'm going. I'm going to explain Foote's naturalism, but due to time limitations, I'm just going to try and draw out what points I think are most pertinent to my contrast between the two women. And then I'm going to present a criticism of Foote by a man called Scott Woodcock. I've called this the continuity objection. Of the various criticisms that Foote faces, this one I think reveals the difference between Midgley and Foote the best, and that's why I've picked this one. And then the second part of my talk, which hopefully will be the more exciting half, I'm going to talk about Mary Midgley and how she might solve some of the problems that Foote, or this one problem that Foote might face. Okay, so on to Foote. This is Philippa Foote. So I'm going to just explain, as I say, the parts that are relevant to the next criticism. So apologies if it's a bit brief. Foote's naturalism. So the central claim that Foote's trying to establish in Natural Goodness is that moral goodness is an aspect of what makes us good as human beings. To establish this conclusion, Foote defends a form of evaluation based on goodness and defect in living things, such as plants and animals. According to this approach, there are objective features of living things that make them good as the members of their species. So, for example, there are features of a deer that make it good or depend on what it is to live a good life as a deer. So, for example, having 4 legs might be something that you need in order to live a good life as a deer. So, according to John Hacker-Wright, who is a leading commentator of Foote, he says that there are 2 central premises that we need to understand in order to get to grips with Foote's naturalism, which I've just drawn out here. I'm going to explain them in turn. So the first one is grasping something as an organism requires us to situate the organism against the background of its species. And second premise is to situate the organism against the background of its species requires us to consider it from a normative perspective. So premise 1, just drawn out. So to claim an organism is living is to situate it against the wider context of its kind. This is what Foote calls a life form. Life forms determine the background of norms, which give sense and understanding to the things that the animals of that species do. So for example, wolves hunt in packs and take care of their young. There is, of course, natural variation within species, most of which isn't essential to defining something as a species. So for example, we would still say that a blue tit is a blue tit if it lacked like the patch on the top of its head. So that's not essential to being a blue tit. But there are certain things that are essential to being a blue tit. So on Foote's account, certain things in the life form are fixed. Things play a vital part in the life of a species. She claims that these are teleologically related to the good. And she uses Aristotle here because her theory is a neo-Aristotelian naturalism. She calls these Aristotelian categoricals. And it's against these that the individual life forms are judged, which brings us on to premise 2, where the normativity enters the picture. So she claims to situate the organism against the background of its species requires us to consider it from a normative perspective. So into a quote from Foote here. For example, because deer escape from predators by running, a certain degree of swiftness is required for a deer to be good qua deer. Against these standards, we can make a normative assessment of individuals in question. So she claims that there is a natural defect, and she uses the word defect, when individuals do not live up to the Aristotelian categorical of their kind. So when a deer cannot run fast, it is defective as a being of its kind. So in doing this, importantly, Foote's recognizing organisms as functionally organized. So basically, the operations of the individual are judged according to and function according to this broader picture. So my human life form is judged according to, or my individual life is judged according to this broader picture of a life form of my species. So in this sense, Aristotelian categoricals are logical concepts. So it's not to do with empirical data for Foote. She has the concept of a species life form, and individuals are judged according to these in a logical way. So John Hacker-Wright stresses this in his interpretation of Foote. He says that the fact that the foundation of Foote's theory are natural because they reflect normative judgments about the needs of living organisms, but they're not meant to be empirical explanatory descriptions of the type that evolutionary biology and the sciences provide. And we're going to go on to give a bit of detail as to why she argues that in forthcoming. So middle chapter of her book, Natural Goodness, is the transition to human beings. So her interesting move here is how she applies these first 2 premises to human beings. She claims that evaluations of goodness for humans are of the same form as evaluations of goodness for living things, such as wolves, peacocks, and oak trees. So the characteristics that reflect goodness in human beings are obviously very different to those that reflect goodness in peacocks or oak trees. You don't have to have strong roots to be a good human being, but the form of evaluation remains the same. So there is no change in the meaning of the word good, as it says on the screen here, when it appears in good roots as it appears in good dispositions of the human will. So, for example, injustice counts as a moral defect in human beings because of the function of cooperation in human life. So that's how naturalism is construed. As such, the proposition humans are cooperative is a genuine Aristotelian categorical on Foote's account. Nearly at the end of Foote's theory now, if you're still with me. Okay, so for Foote, interestingly, for the next section, the lives of non-human animals are exhausted by what she calls a life cycle. So that is development, self-sustenance, and reproduction. So all of the individual operations that happen in an animal's life can be judged by these life cycles. So they all fit into something to do with development, sustenance, or reproduction. But crucial to the human good is the human ability to recognize and respond to reasons for action. It's precisely the application of reason why we're interested in ethical evaluation at all. So moral evaluations of human beings are specially connected to voluntary actions and thus do not correspond to any equivalent evaluations of goodness in plants or non-human animals. So Foote here argues that evaluations of goods in humans are specifically moral claims about the rational will and do not have to do with what Foote calls a physical defect according to the natural norms of our species. So a physical defect, she says something such as being lesser abled or being blind. So it's got nothing to do with physical defects. So we're going on to now to this middle section of my talk, which is the continuity objection. So this is against Foote's analogy. She targets primarily, and Woodcock's criticism targets primarily the analogy between this physical and rational defect, as I say here. So Foote's analogy treads a very careful line in order to avoid the claim that physical defects are one and the same as moral defects. This would be like claiming that the thief is defective in the same way as the blind person. This is because, so Foote's analogy, as I said before, can't be taken empirically. Otherwise, she would be guilty of making this morally scandalous conclusion. So that's why she's treading away, or one of the reasons why she's coming away from the empirical analogy. So she avoids claiming that evaluation of human action is only connected to rational action. But according to Woodcock, he claims that this move, Foote's transition from animals to humans, seems to cut the cord to considerations that are related to the human life cycle, which will undermine the continuity that was supposed to make Foote's appeal to natural normativity unique. So that thing that was supposed to make Foote's naturalism unique is the way that the content of practical reason is determined by the natural facts of living beings, aka humans. So if the Aristotelian categoricals that specify this content are completely distinct from empirical details about our species, then questions begin to arise about how Foote is establishing her Aristotelian categoricals about humans in the first place if they aren't empirical or tethered to the human life cycle in any way. Okay, so instead, the details of the human life cycle seem to play a secondary, this is a quote, the details, Scott Woodcock, instead, the details of the human life cycle seem to play a secondary, if not dispensable role in Foote's account of how practical reason determines the content of virtues. It's not clear how the normative status of virtues is clearly being derived from natural facts as was promised. So if rational defects are a distinct species of defect, this seems to create some sort of distinctive field of the moral for Foote, which she was initially trying to disabuse us of. So the result is a plausible view, as Scott Woodcock as John Hacker Wright points out. He says this is a plausible view, but it's properly described as some version of Kantianism rather than a form of neo-Aristotelianism, as she wanted to be grounded in the natural facts of our species. So there's some sort of gap going on here. And I'm going to say that Mary Midgley's naturalism can try and solve the problem for us. Okay, so my claim. Oh, sorry, just a few quick notes first. I'm just going to explain the parts of Midgley's naturalism that are going to be relevant to the continuity worries, but I do want to note that Midgley's naturalism is like rich and broad and exhaustive, and this definitely doesn't exhaust that. I just want to begin to make the suggestion that Midgley's naturalism, which has been henceforth unappreciated, has rich resources, which is relevant to modern discussions of naturalism. Okay, so my claim is that Midgley is able to maintain the content of practical rationality as determined by natural facts about living things without cutting the cord to considerations about the biological lives of human beings. And she does this via her notion of integration. I'm going to explain all this. So, Midgley's naturalism. Unlike Foote, Midgley has a constitutive notion of animal and human nature. So human nature is a cauldron of needs and wants that form into a cluster. So unlike the Footean account, characteristics of species are empirically observed and not functionally derived. So they're gathered by biologists, ethologists, and anthropologists to form an empirically informed picture of a species and the individuals belonging to said species. So as I quote on the board here, she writes in Beast and Man, "The nature of a species then consists in a certain range of powers and tendencies inherited and forming a fairly firm characteristic pattern, though conditions after birth can vary in details quite a lot. So we have innate tendencies such as the need for shelter, the desire to be loved and wanted, but each tendency is broad. So it has its own, she says, natural stint and bound, its own boundaries and its own balance. As such, rather than being an intrinsically normative, human nature and animal nature are made up of wants and needs, which normativity is then derived from. Our human nature is a contingent product of our evolutionary history, according to Midgley. And as I will go on to show in this next section, this provides a natural setting for our practical rationality and hopefully solves the problem of continuity. Integration. So this is a really interesting, rich concept, which I think hasn't been drawn out of Midgley and naturalism. I think this places her within like a lot of contemporary debate, but basically she's claiming that she makes the empirical observation in Beast and Man that we are the kinds of beings that have natural need to integrate ourselves. And the naturalistic claim that, at least in part, the prescriptive force of our wants and needs comes from this natural demand to integrate our being. We have, Midgley writes, a deep need for unity that is luckily to be found at our centre. People have a natural wish and capacity to integrate themselves, a natural horror of being totally fragmented. So according to Midgley, we naturally experience struggles between competing wants and needs. We experience moments of conflict, which call us to prioritise and to specify which action will best serve us as a whole. So we seek balance, and Midgley claims our moral senses tune to this balance. So for humans, it matters to us in a moral sense that we are integrated. It matters that our personalities are balanced, and one element does not become superior to the rest. So on the level of experience, I think this rings true. We find it hard to reconcile when we find goodness and inadequacy present in the same person at the same time. So continuing on this integration, how does this help us to solve the problem of continuity? So integration provides the natural setting for our practical rationality. I think it starts to link this, this cord that was cut. It provides the natural setting for practical rationality and morality to operate within. So in a straightforward sense, Midgley does not cut the cord to those innate tendencies provided to us by our life cycle. Rather, these are providing the basis of our everyday integration and moral reflection. Importantly, unlike Foot's conception of rationality, Midgley's notion of integration spans across life forms, so it's not unique to human beings. Challenges of internal conflict happen in other species, meaning other animals also negotiate needs, though to a lesser extent, obviously, than human beings. So in Beast and Man, Midgley writes, using the example of wolves, she says, they act on purposive patterns provided to them by their lasting character traits, expressing priorities. Prioritizing proper care of young rather than neglect or brutal treatment of them is a good thing in the life of a wolf. When the wolf's instinct is prioritized, when the wrong instinct is prioritized, it is not just unfortunate, it is out of character. They show something wrong, something is disproportionate to their nature as a whole. So as such, rather than a logical analogy between humans and non-human animals, as is the case for Foot, for Midgley there is an explicit empirical comparison to be made between species. Midgley begins her first book, Beast and Man, by explicitly resisting attempts to sever the link between humans and non-human animals. She insists famously, we are not just like animals, we are animals. Since it is the need or the want itself that is prescriptive on us, that is normative, her position draws no prima facie difference between humans and non-human animals, as Foot's theory does. And indeed, if they ever spoke about this, which I can't find evidence that they did, Midgley would probably reject Foot's view that she would reject Foot's view that all human creatures can be placed into a homogeneous category of animals, as Foot does, and be labelled or explained by life cycles of reproduction and growth. So Midgley would say that Foot hasn't captured the whole life form of the non-human animal in this sense. So coming towards the end here, practical rationality in humans emerges as she claims a structural property to help us negotiate the innumerable complex nature of human wants and needs. So it may be that it's something exclusive to our species, but this is due to our biology rather than regardless of it. So practical rationality just intensifies conflict that we experience by allowing us to reflect on our choices. So notably, Foot might come back at Midgley here. It's a possible reply from a Footian. She might say that Midgley brings back the issue of disabled or lesser abled individuals. That is, that she might have the morally scandalous conclusion that moral defect is the same as rational defect. It does seem on face value, Midgley's theory doesn't appear to solve this problem. If anything, it might seem to tighten the grip of this criticism by increasing the dictates of our biological nature upon us. But this is would be a misreading of Midgley. Her notion of diverse life forms answers this problem. She's actually very clear on how to answer this. So she writes, human needs are multiple. We have many sorts of good because we have many sorts of want. So by dropping a view of living beings as functionally organised, Midgley's account admits a complex and multifaceted variety of possible life forms, and with this, innumerable ways of organising ourselves according to this good. So in this sense, she might be seen to delimit Foot's stricter account of what it is to live a good life as an individual, according to this broader whole. Though the features and capacities we inherit in our biological nature provide the limits or the stint and bound of our wants and needs, for Midgley there's a rich variety of life that can fulfill this need. So we could interpret Midgley as saying that the good life of any individual or human individual is determined not by elements of the repertoire you happen to have, but by how you consistently integrate yourself, which for humans involves practical rationality. As such, rationality remains within the realm of the biological, but we can worry less about the exclusion of what Foot might see as less than perfect people because of the flexibility of what Mary Midgley takes to be the biological goals of human beings. In conclusion, Foot's naturalism seems to use human biology to elucidate rationality, but she loses the tether to our biological nature, according to Woodcock. Midgley's naturalism doesn't do this. She doesn't rely on any cord cutting to the human life cycle in this way. She retains a clear continuity, leaving her with a robust claim to naturalism. And just my sources are here. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Eleanor, for your talk. So hello, everyone. We are still waiting for our next speaker, Vania dos Santos Silva. She has not shown up yet. So
sorry, I think she's here.
Yes, I'm here. My name is Vania, but I want to be called by Aya.
Okay, so that's you, Vania dos Santos.
Yes.
Okay, yeah, now and because it says Aya, he passed here, so now I see it.
Yeah.
Vania dos Santos in brackets. Yeah. Of course, yeah. Then we just continue with your talk. Yeah.
Okay.
Fine. And you're also you're now working as a PhD candidate.
I finished it last year. My PhD. Yeah.
Okay. And so you're now assistant professor in Brazil.
No, now I'm jobless. I'm
okay. So not in Brazil anymore, but you're.
Yes, I'm in Brazil, and here it's morning, and good evening for you, and good morning for Brazilian people here.
But at least you're still engaged in here this forum for discussion and debates of public policies for women in Goiás. This is still the case, or?
Yes, it's still the case.
Okay, fantastic.
I'm talking from the Midwest. Goiás, it's a city close to the capital.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay, then you will give us a talk today about the ontology of gender in Plato and Euripides, right?
Yes,
ancient bodies and gender performativity. Then it's your turn. I'm glad you have you here.
Okay, thank you. I changed a bit my the title of my speech for gender issues in Plato and the Euripides ancient bodies and gender performativity. But in this communication, I will focus on Euripides because of the time. But before my reading, I will ask permission to say a few words. It's about the awful political moment that we live in Brazil, that directly hitting the public education, the humanities field, and particularly the philosophy field. Thousands of young women and men that get their doctorate degrees recently are jobless, like me. Now, since 2016, the year of the coup in Brazil, we do not live in a democratic society. We have an authoritarian, a misogynist, a homophobic, a racist president, and the list of worst adjectives continue. We must stop him, the President Bolsonaro, and we need to whole world to help us get him out and to build one country better to everyone. It's what I want to say before. And said that, I will read the paper that I wrote for today, yeah, to focus, as I said, on Euripides, the Bacchae. So I will draw on Judith Butler's gender performativity theory to analyze the classical test of Greek antiquity, the Bacchae by Euripides. The concept of gender performativity will be used to illustrate analogously, even anachronically, how much the Greek imaginary, despite by being temporarily distant, can fruitfully contribute to what we would identify as one of the most sophisticated contemporary theories in contemporary gender studies. Considering the historical context and the question that are specific to the world of ancient Greece, the analysis will permit us to cast light on the strategies that Euripides drew on the disrupting the gender norms of the polis. The tradition of feminist studies, which merges with a disciplinary field known today by the perhaps more politically correct term gender studies, gives us an understanding of the categories of sex as produced by a specific power constellation which aims to rhetorically create the effect of its own originality, naturality, and inevitability, as Judith Butler said. That is a binary distinction of sex, which fixes the feminine and masculine in an imaginative dichotomy. The construction of this binary opposition follows the intention to relegate the feminine to the place of paranomia, with respect of the point of view of empowered masculinity, which attributes to itself the function of nomos. The naturalization of the sexual roles, therefore, would be rhetorical result of a specific power strategy. The economy of these pages does not permit that we examine with the detail it deserves. However, what most interests us is the hypothesis that ancient Greek culture and the roots with it is quite distant from this definition of the sexual man-woman dichotomy as we know it in our modernity, namely as rhetorically justified in the natural biological distinction of sex. If, on one hand, it is certainly not justified to be speaking about gender relation in ancient Greece, in dualistic contemporary terms of gender, sex, gender, on the other hand, read the ancient texts, the vertical way of organized relations between men and women thus catch the eye. This hierarchy has in the man the prerogative toward the economy of power and the status of individuals. Neither is the well-known importance that the Greek gave to human reproductions often limited the role of women to reproduction, to simple receptacle. The body as receptacle was her destiny. With these observations in mind, I will analyze the Bacchae by Euripides. This will allow us to analyze to what degree these texts present one or the other approach. An alternative in which gender relations might be different, both from the ancient and contemporary period. Greek culture, particularly the Athenian culture, appears to be oriented more along lines of what in contemporary theory with Butler we call gender performative. That is, deliberate performative acts that can be developed into both the naturalization and the reaffirmation of gender norms. The cultural intelligibility of the performance is what tells whether the acts subvert the norms or whether it is co-opted by the process of imitation of acts, which, due to the endless repetitions, seek to normalize, conform, and identify the material with the performance, or in other words, the anatomic sex with gender identity. Thus, in this, it is a well-known fact that in Greek theatre, the tragedies and political were linked by the way they touched on questions which compelling the spectators. In the theater of Euripides, we see a classical example of the notion of performative gender acts. Thus, in Bacchae, Euripides is represented as a god whose gender performance is ambiguous. This god of excess enacts performances that cross the boundaries of the social-political limits on anatomy. He carries out a true parody, and shows himself to be conscious that the very origin of that which he imitates and the performance is already a copy. In this way, he plays with the norms as he does not have a fixed definition, and by knowing that there is no ideal onto which we might attach such norms. As Jacqueline Homily notes, Dionysus plays with images. He starts the play under a false identity which he maintains till the end. Thus, he passes for a Lydian Christ, and only the spectator is on the secret. It is also necessary to see how he makes of Pentheus. Thus, Dionysus observed Pentheus infuriated as he played with transform his body. In this play, the personality of Pentheus is a man who is put in a governing position, that is, in a position of power. One of the characteristics of his mode of governing is the aversion to all change of already established norms. Thus, Pentheus not only expresses refusion about the performance of Dionysus, but also those that accompany him, the women that leave the house, and even Cadmus and the Tiresias who, in their old age, do not stop honoring the god of timbers and dances. His acts are political acts, and he insists on showing his sovereignty. Pentheus thus claims for himself to power to decide who lives, how to live, and who dies. Let us allow for Pentheus' own verses to elucidate this dynamism that today we call with Foucault and Agamben biopoder, and it is so familiar to us. Thus, for biopoder life does not matter, but only some types of life. The lives that do not matter are left to abjection. The extermination of such abjections, boring, incoherent, and unintelligible is a common political practice, and it's one more demonstration to affirm who institutes the norm and coherence by the obvious means of force and fear. In this way, the lives of those who matter, that is, of those that carry in their bodies the normalization of the sovereign discourse will have their lives spared, not because they matter, in fact, but because they help maintain the sovereignty of those that have the force and the power to dictate which performative acts should be realized. In this way, the spectators of horror and death serves as landscape to be appreciated. The Dionysius asks to Pentheus, but for all your pain, you'd be very glad to see it, Pentheus says. Yes, very much. I could crouch beneath the four trees quietly. Finished quote. And what happens when Dionysus tires of the parrot and starts to intervene into politics? The punishment that Pentheus receives is, as we know, dressed as that which is repugnant to him, a bacchant. He not just dresses, but also performs. Surrendering to Dionysus, Pentheus, in a state of madness, not only changes his clothes, but also his identity as a man of power. He permits himself to shake like a bacchant, as has a performance as bacchant. It is in this way that the effeminate stranger manages to take vengeance on those that do not honor his divinity. However, he does more than take vengeance. He succeeds in rupturing the nucleus that sustains the same sovereignty. The death of Pentheus symbolizes the disruption of the family, such as it signified in ancient Greece. Cadmus is deprived of male offspring. Women, even under the intoxicating effect of Dionysus, carry out an insurrectionist performative act that they pride themselves of, and they understand that the limits to which they are subjected. They understand that the boys can do more than the limits imposed by the polis. As instead, in the above, as performative gender acting both reaffirming a norm as well as based on the norm, promote the proliferation of others' way of being. It is in this broad sense that the unfolding of events was the subversive. It was more so because this crossing between genders, this disobedience to the idealized form of gender was externalized into the political field of it, has effects that are moral, ethical, and certainly political. The gender performativity of bacchantes, even if in a transitory way, give that occurred in the temporary space of Dionysus' Ritus, pointed to a way to suspend the model of the Athenian political system of the 5th and 4th centuries. That is a paradigm which, in this practice, subordinated women to reproduce activities of the polis above all. Thus, Euripides shows how much the borders between the masculine and feminine, as much in the sphere of sexuality as in the sphere of political, are diffuse and emerge from political discourse. As Butler points out, which seeks to conform the possibility of the acts of gender performative with a binary narrative of gender identities. Euripides in the theater presents a vision of which configurations a seat can get, depending on the ethos of the person governing it. In this way, he showed us a polis dominated by political practice that segregated and excluded all forms of manifestations of that which was not recognized recognized as tradition given by the sovereign power. Yes, and maybe I will finish here because I will not talk about Plato. I think we don't have time to this. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. So you finished. Thank you, Vania. Is this right, or shall I say Aya? What is best for you?
Aya.
Aya. Okay. Thank you, Aya, very much for your talk.